From unexplained creatures in the jungle to a haunted apartment building in Saigon, these Vietnam War mysteries are straight out of the X-Files. There are aviation mysteries aplenty, and Flying Tiger Line Flight 739 is one of the strangest ones. The cargo plane took off on March 15, 1962, departing Guam and flying to an Air Force base in the Philippines before eventually traveling on to Saigon. It carried 11 crew members and 96 passengers, all of whom had military connections to either the US or South Vietnam. All seemed fine for the first couple of hours, but then Flight 739 disappeared. By 8:22 a.m. on March 16th, the plane and all of its passengers were officially declared lost. All efforts to unearth the truth behind the plane's disappearance over the past 60 years have proved unsuccessful. The only real clue was a report from the crew of the tanker ship who reported a bright explosion in the sky around 1:30 a.m. They saw two objects fall into the sea, but the following search recovered absolutely no debris from the flight. One theory is that the plane could have been tampered with in Guam. Another is that the plane and its passengers were actually captured. But that's not where the oddities end. Families of those missing soldiers have spoken about their mistreatment at the hands of the US government, which has long refused to add their names to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial and failed to provide any military service at the funerals. In recent years, a memorial was unveiled in Columbia Falls, Maine. Who knows, maybe there's a completely logical explanation and the government isn't up to anything nefarious.
Not likely.
On the surface, the Mayaguez Incident just seems to be the final battle of the Vietnam War. On May 12th, the Mayaguez, an American cargo ship, was attacked by Khmer Rouge forces. The crew managed to get a distress signal out, and a few days later, the US sent reinforcements to save the sailors who had been taken to the nearby Cambodian island of Koh Tang. The whole thing was a huge mess. Not only were the Marines forced into a firefight against forces they weren't prepared for, they were essentially fighting for no reason. Turns out the crew was released by the Khmer Rouge just as the assault on Koh Tang began. After experiencing heavy resistance and suffering numerous casualties, which included the destruction of 3 helicopters, all the Marines could do was wait for rescue. Eventually, the helicopters picked them up under the belief that all surviving Marines had been extracted. That is, until later that night when a radio call came in and a voice asked when the next helicopter would arrive. As it turned out, 3 Marines, Danny Marshall, Gary Hall, and Joseph Hargrove, were still stuck on the island, but the military refused to mount a rescue operation. The 3 men disappeared, and to this day, no one knows exactly what happened to them. Officially, the US Marine stance is that the 3 disobeyed orders by not making it to the choppers on time. In 2016, the Defense POW MIA accounting agency announced that they found Hall's ID card in an empty burial pit, but that did little to help solve the mystery of what happened to the 3 left behind. Whether or not the fates of the crewmen of Baron 52 counts as a mystery depends almost entirely on whose story you're more likely to believe. The official story says that all crew members of Baron 52, the code name for a spy plane shot down over Laos in early February 1973, died in the crash, and all of their remains had been identified by the mid-1990s. But many people, including the families of those soldiers, have reason to be skeptical.
I don't know. Sure seems fishy.
For one, the original investigation of the crash site found only 4 bodies. The 4 crew members in the back were missing, as was the rear escape door and all the parachutes. Then there were intercepted radio transmissions and witness accounts claiming that North Vietnamese soldiers had captured 4 pilots near Baron 52's crash site. The whole situation prompted speculation that the surviving crew was being held captive, and the insistence by the Pentagon that the men had been killed in action only led to accusations of a cover-up. Later investigations led to the discovery of a dog tag and bone fragments, but it all seemed too convenient to family members of the missing soldiers. All of that is only complicated by the larger context. Baron 52 was shot down a week after the Paris Peace Agreement, which would have made the mission technically illegal. Admitting that these men were alive and subsequently negotiating for their release would mean admitting to running illegal spying missions. Just declaring the soldiers dead might have been the easiest way through a potentially disastrous situation. When it comes to missing persons and POWs taken during the Vietnam War, there are plenty of discussions to be had. After all, over 1,000 Americans are still unaccounted for, and discussions of bringing captured Americans home tends to be a pretty hot topic. One of the stranger cases, however, has to do with the disappearance of Dr. Eleanor Ardell Vietti in 1962. Vietti acted as a medic in the war, helping South Vietnam's Montagnard population with the Christian and Missionary Alliance. Things went south for her on May 20th, 1962, when guerrilla fighters appeared in the village. They ordered Vietti to go with them, tying up 2 other volunteers, Archie Mitchell and Dan Gerber, in the process. All 3 were taken, never to be seen again, but the reasons and circumstances have remained hazy. No ransom was ever made for their return, which only added to the confusion. Higher-ups of the Christian and Missionary Alliance suspect the raid was directed toward obtaining more medical supplies. A Des Moines Tribune article from later in 1962 mentioned a captured guerrilla fighter who actually referenced Vietti directly. Reportedly, she was treating wounded Viet Cong soldiers and traveling alongside Mitchell and Gerber, all of them unharmed. A 1965 Battle Creek Inquirer article included very similar claims from Viet Cong prisoners, that all three were being shuttled from village to village to provide medical aid, but any attempts to make contact were apparently unsuccessful. She wasn't listed as presumed dead until 1991, and reports of her being seen were documented throughout the 1970s. Peace talks during the Vietnam War were a fraught, messy business, to put it very simply. If you want proof of that, it's probably worth mentioning that Washington and Hanoi officials agreed to talks in Paris in the spring of 1968, but no agreement was signed until 1973. Even then, there were plenty of attempts to feel out the possibility of peace between 1965 and 1968, all of which were shot down. And that's the context in which Operation Marigold exists, an attempt at peace dated to 1966. As far as anyone knows, this whole thing stemmed from an organization known as the ICC, meant to monitor compliance with the Geneva Accords, and was chaired by countries neutral in the Vietnam War. A Polish diplomat essentially became an intermediary between the US and North Vietnam, and in June, the possibility of peace talks seemed very real. But for some reason, that channel disappeared, and for reasons just as mysterious as those behind its creation. The US proceeded to blame the Polish government for lying about the possibility of peace, calling their credibility into question. But here's the thing. Later investigations indicated that Operation Marigold was a very real possibility, and the North Vietnamese were actually open to the idea of peace. The Johnson administration squandered their chances, and the reasons may never be known. An unnamed associate to the president has even been reported saying that the public would never find out because it would be a stain on the government's reputation. Not all Vietnam War mysteries necessarily took place in Vietnam. Rather, some mysteries took place right in the United States, such as the murder of Robert Daniel Corriveau. Corriveau was a decorated corporal in the Marines, wounded 3 times during the Vietnam War. In late 1968, he was back on American soil for treatment at the Naval Hospital Philadelphia, specifically regarding psychiatric treatment for symptoms arising from combat. This was possibly PTSD, though it wouldn't have an official name and diagnosis until after the war. On the night of November 18th, Corriveau suddenly disappeared from the hospital, and the military labeled him a deserter, a badge of dishonor that would remain for over 40 years. The truth, though, is that his body was recovered soon after his disappearance. The authorities just didn't know it was Corriveau who'd been discovered. On the same night he disappeared, just 30 miles west of Philadelphia, a state trooper happened upon a body while on patrol. The cause of death was a single stab wound through the heart. The body was listed as a John Doe since he was found without any identification. Not until 2012 did a DNA test reveal that it was Corriveau. Shortly after, he was buried with proper military honors. As of this video, the Pennsylvania State Police are still hoping that someone will eventually come forward with more information. Life for a soldier in the Vietnam War was pretty rough, and spending a bunch of time in the heat amid conflict would be reason enough to explain some odd sightings. But when it comes to the reported sightings of so-called rock apes, well, it's hard to ignore the fact that a bunch of soldiers, both American and Vietnamese, reported this particular mystery. So what exactly were these soldiers seeing? Particularly around the Santra Peninsula, many soldiers reported being attacked by mysterious creatures that were somewhat humanoid in appearance, save their 5-inch long fangs and ape-like facial features. They stood around 6 feet tall and were typically pretty calm, easily navigating around the rocky terrain, until the soldiers attacked them, which incited them to hurl rocks back in retaliation. No one knew what these creatures were. No one has ever even taken a picture of them. No bodies have been found either. Officials on both sides of the war were left scratching their heads about what their soldiers were seeing, with a Vietnamese general even ordering an official expedition to catch one in 1974, which proved unsuccessful. Scientists chimed in as well, considering various species of apes and monkeys, only to come up empty on viable explanations. None of these animals actually lived in the jungles of Vietnam. In the end, everyone just had to settle for this complete lack of answers, the rock apes joining the ranks of famous cryptids. Or maybe they're aliens, right, Giorgio?
Yes, exactly.
The POW situation surrounding the Vietnam War really is a complicated one, with plenty of mysteries surrounding those who went missing in action. The story of Vietnam's last POW is no exception to that. In fact, it's actually something of a particularly odd story. Charles Shelton was a pilot tasked with flying secret reconnaissance missions during the war, specifically operating over Laos. On April 26, 1965, he was sent out on a mission. 3 days later, his plane was shot down and he was captured 6 days after that. Shelton's family was sent a package of a few personal effects, objects that you'd think were on his person when the plane went down. This is an indication that it was likely a black ops mission the military didn't want anyone learning about. It became clear to them that he wouldn't be getting much help, and all they had to go on were occasional stories that he was still alive. But as the war drew to a close, his family assumed that meant he would come home with all of the other POWs, except he didn't. On the contrary, his name was on the list of those believed to be killed in action, and official reports soon said that no other soldiers were returning from Southeast Asia. His family had to accept this assumption until the Freedom of Information Act allowed for a plethora of classified documents to be released, which were filled with reports that suggested Shelton was still alive.
There are reports in his file that he was shot in the legs because they were so tired of him escaping, and more reports that he just kept trying to escape afterwards.
These revelations ultimately led to him being reclassified as a prisoner of war in 1984. He was, however, declared dead a decade later at the request of his children after an unsuccessful search was conducted at the site of the crash. To this day, no one knows what really happened to him. During the Vietnam War, the US needed a place for its soldiers to live, and the military ended up looking towards an apartment building located at 727 Chan Hun Zao. Originally, the tower was built in 1960 and commissioned by a millionaire, but there was something a bit disconcerting about it from the start, the fact it had 13 floors. Despite warnings from the architect, plans didn't change, and as the 13th floor was completed, strange accidents began to plague the workers. A local shaman was brought in to cleanse the building, with customs saying that burying dead bodies at each corner would keep it safe from any spiritual intruders. The US Army came and went as the timeline of the Vietnam War ran its course, but strange stories have persisted even long after the American soldiers left. To this day, residents of the building have reported strange and scary occurrences. Sometimes they hear whispers and voices around the halls. At other times, they've heard sounds that resembled those of a military parade. Perhaps most disturbingly, they've even claimed to hear screams. But the haunting isn't confined to only audio phenomena. Some residents have claimed to seen a couple of spirits that walk the halls, an American soldier holding hands with his Vietnamese girlfriend.